we end up summing up ourselves by our collectively worst moments. The flip side of that is we look at everyone else only by their best. So recent years, for instance, we've heard an awful lot, certainly since 9/11, about the Islamic Neoplatonists. No one talks very much about the Islamic Neoplatonists until this last 20 years. But the Islamic world is best represented by the Islamic Neoplatonists, whereas Europe is best represented by Auschwitz. Well, here you get to one of the problems of this, is that we are...
That's just uninformed.
Yeah, of course it's uninformed. All of it's uninformed, and it's also imbibed by vast swathes of the public and told to them by a huge amount of academics, media, politicians, and others. There's several reasons for that, isn't there? One is that you can do that almost cost-free as a modern politician, can't you? It's like the endless apologies for historical acts. It can gain you something, but it costs you nothing. All you're doing is selling out and misrepresenting the past. But you yourself might be able to polish a bit of your halo or burnish your reputation in some way.
Europe's identity crisis, self-loathing, or survival. Watch Douglas Murray dissect Europe's cultural crossroads, where guilt-ridden politics meet demographic reality. From London's transformed boroughs to Sweden's integration challenges, Murray exposes how post-war guilt morphed into what he calls civilizational masochism. While European leaders dodge statistics and rebrand concerns as bigotry, Murray asks, at what point does willful blindness become societal? Whether you agree or disagree, this brutally honest analysis demands attention.
Douglas Murray, welcome.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
The strange death of Europe. I quote, Europe is committing suicide, or at least its leaders have decided to commit suicide. Whether the European people choose to go along with this is naturally another matter, close quote. We'll come to your argument in a moment, but the book appeared in 2017. For now, what do you make of what the people are willing to put up with 2 years after you published the book?
It's very interesting. In the 2 years since it came out, it's been coming out I think it's now out in every European language. So I've been pretty constantly, I'm in a different country every week in Europe and elsewhere. And so I get a pretty good sense of where things are. I would say there are several things. The direction of travel hasn't changed, but some of those in positions of power have done things that I was surprised they would be willing to do to slow it down. I'm thinking particularly of the fact that the book centers on the migration crisis of 2015, which I just see as a sped-up version of something that had been happening for decades. But since 2015, the European leaders, among other things, did a deal with President Caliph Erdogan, and he now has a gun to Europe's head that he knows he can fire at any point.
The deal. Can you just explain that? I'm going to have to stop you from time to time to make sure that for an American audience, we're very explicit. Erdogan is president of Turkey, and the nature of the deal was?
We Europeans pay him huge sums of money, and he stops boats leaving the Turkish shores for Greek islands.
Right, and it is just as crude and straightforward as that.
He's not doing it out of the kindness of his heart.
Right.
And things like that have undoubtedly meant that the flow of 2015 has slowed. The boats are still setting off from the North African coastline, but nothing like the rate of 2015. So there have been some things like that that have surprised me.
All right. Let's lay out the basic argument. So you're not concerned with any kind of temporary European malaise or questions of slow economic growth, which is a lot of what we hear on the other side of the big water. Again, I'm quoting you. Europe today has little desire to reproduce itself, fight for itself, or even take its own side in an argument. By the end of the lifespans of most people currently alive in Europe, Europe will not be Europe, and the peoples of Europe will have lost the only place in the world we had to call home, close quote. 2 years later, you stand, but that's a very dramatic statement. 2 years later, you stand by that.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, in the lifespans of, as I say, most people, it'll be a different place. It already is. And I lay some of that out in remorseless detail in The Strange Death of Europe. Sometimes when things happen relatively slowly, people get used to things, they adapt. I give the example of the census in the UK, the last census in the UK, which showed that in 23 out of 33 London boroughs, people who identify as white British are in the minority in those boroughs. So that in the lifespan of, I mean, you can either like that, dislike it, or feel benign about it. But that's a massive change in just one person's lifespan already.
John Cleese tweeted, as we taped this, I think it was last week, John Cleese of Monty Python fame tweeted, "London no longer seems to be an English city." I think that's a close paraphrase, if not a quotation. And he was attacked, the attack, as attacks are on Twitter.
Yeah.
But he was correct.
He was correct. And by the way,
factually correct.
What he said is effectively what is boasted about by politicians, including the Mayor of London and the previous Mayor of London. They say, it's an international city. They're very happy about that.
Right.
But if somebody says, well, that means it's not an English city anymore.
Murray exposes Europe's cultural suicide, while leftists applaud their own demise. London's native Brits are now minorities in 70% of boroughs. Paris has 751 no-go zones. And Brussels throws billions at Erdogan's refugee blackmail scheme. Meanwhile, Swedish cities like Malmö showcase the catastrophic results of unrestricted Islamic immigration, with sexual assault rates up 500% since 2015. When the last cathedral becomes a mosque, will Europe's progressives still be celebrating diversity?
Then they attack somebody like, whether it's John Cleese, me, or whoever, for heresy. I mean, it's very interesting, by the way, isn't it? I mean, John Cleese was attacked for the heresy of Life of Brian, 40 years ago. Yes. He's attacked by the clerics now. It's just they're the clerics of the far left and the social justice movements and so on. They just happen not to wear frocks like his previous critics. But it's the same phenomenon. I've debated and discussed these issues for years now, and I know every one of the moves that people do. The number of dishonest moves, things like, that's not the case. Okay, that is the case. That is the case, but you shouldn't say it. Or, that is the case, and it's great, suck it up.
Right. So, to continue with the basic argument, this has come about, this death of Europe, this has come about, quote, because of two simultaneous concatenations from which it is now all but impossible to recover. The first is the mass movement of peoples into Europe, close quote. So explain that. Explain 2015 and tell us what happened in 2015. Remind us, and that was a speeded up version of what? Well, again, you're talking to a largely American audience here, so fill us in.
Basically, in the aftermath of the Second World War, most Western European countries decided that they wanted to invite migrant labor in to help rebuild. At the beginning, the idea was that they wouldn't stay. They would come and then they'd go home after doing the job. Unsurprisingly, they did stay, or at least large proportions of them did. And gradually, people started to be brought in even if there weren't jobs for them to go to. So, for instance, you imported large numbers of people from the Indian subcontinent to mill towns in the north of England when there were no mills anymore. And
the thinking on that was?
I'm not sure there was very much thinking. It was what we call the cock-up view of history, a succession of lazy and cowardly politicians who just found it easier to kick this one down the road and leave it to their successors to deal with. We kept changing the story of what we were doing as we were doing it. I recount in the book, we moved from the guest worker period to the multicultural period where you said, live in our country and sort of pretty much do what you like, to the modern one, which is become like us. Now, those are three totally different things in the course, again, of one person's lifetime. And I blame no migrant for being confused by that because we were confused. But in 2015, the movement got to its height of total unregulated movement. And this was the year in which it had started off in the beginning of this decade we're in, partly people fleeing the Syrian civil war, but then people from all across sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, the Far East. And I started traveling to the camps in southern Europe where people were arriving in. I've been to many of the countries they were fleeing from. And it was a veritable United Nations of people. Now, in the eyes of some of the governments and many of the public, it was all people fleeing the Syrian civil war, but it wasn't. It wasn't. Even by the EU's own figures, at least 60% of the arrivals in 2015 had no more right to be in Europe than anyone else in the rest of the world.
So when Angela Merkel invited 1 million refugees was the term. Migrants, let's call them migrants. Yeah. When she invited 1 million of them into Germany, This is crude. I'll put it badly. You sharpen up what I'm about to say, because this is the way an American would look at it. The Germans are still acting in some way or another out of a sense of war guilt.
Sure.
That's straightforward.
Oh, absolutely straightforward. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, this is a job for a psychiatrist in many ways. Look at the reception at Munich station. As 10,000 people were arriving every 48 hours or so at the height of the movement in 2015.
Are Germany's collective guilt complex in action? While Merkel virtue signalled with her refugees welcome circus, 60% weren't even Syrian war refugees. Talk about historical overcorrection. Post-war Europe's guest worker experiment morphed into today's demographic roulette, with Germany leading the cultural surrender. Meanwhile, Islamic anti-Semitism in Berlin soars 65% year over year. Who knew national atonement meant importing a new wave of Jew hatred? Psychiatrists needed in Brussels. Stat.
They were coming up through the Balkans and up through Central Europe. And there were crowds at Munich train station, high-fiving the arrivals, giving them balloons, teddy bears. What was it? It's perfectly obvious. It was Germans elated at the sight of people breaking into their country rather than trying to break out.
Right. So, but even at that, even if it was a kind of act of German self-indulgence, an acting out of war guilt, the whole argument was that these people were unfortunate, that they were fleeing civil war, and you're saying that 60% of them simply weren't.
A lot more than 60%. I mean, what you get into in all of the issues with migration is, and specifically European migration, is people find it incredibly hard to know where you salami slice issues. So, for instance, they say, yes, we'll have people coming in who are genuinely fleeing the Syrian civil war, for instance.
Right.
Well, there's an argument about that as well. You can look after 100 Syrians in a neighboring country for every one you look after in Europe. So it's not efficient in all sorts of ways, whether or not it's humane. But let's say that, yes, okay, people fleeing the Syrian civil war. But then you have the people, including the aid agencies, making the point, well, and one Afghan refugee made this to me to my face. He said, Syrians have only been at war for 5 years. We've been at war for 15 years. Why should they have priority? Very good question. So you go along that, and then you get to the thing that all of the aid agencies and the NGOs and others have been doing for years, which is you elide and rub out the difference between people fleeing war and people fleeing economic deprivation.
Right.
Now, one of the reasons why I'm quite tough about this is because I know where that argument leads. Gallup last year did a poll in sub-Saharan Africa. 1/3 of sub-Saharan Africans want to move. They're not going to go to Saudi Arabia. They're not planning to break into Yemen. They want to come to Europe. Now, in my view, the catastrophe underlying all of this is the presumption that every country in the world is basically a country for the people of that country, apart from Europe, and Europe is a place for the world.
All right. A few figures from the book. Even as I was reading the argument, these figures, it takes a while to adjust. Again, it's because an American, our notion of what's taking place in Europe lags, I think. But I found every one of these things shocking. By 2015, I'm taking these from your book. By 2015, more British Muslims were fighting for ISIS than for the British Armed Forces. Yeah. By 2016, the most popular boy's name in England and Wales, Mohammed. By the middle of this century, this is a projection, by the middle of this century, a majority of Austrians under the age of 15 will be Muslim. And it is single-digit numbers of years ago that every one of those was unthinkable. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, I smile because, I find it...
You're used to it.
I find it... if I didn't laugh, I'd cry. I've done the crying. I mean, the point about this is that, again, all of these things you're meant to not notice. You're meant to not say it either. You're meant to say, yeah, okay, so Mohammed happens to be the most popular boy. Then what are you saying? Bigot?
Right.
What's wrong with that? Right. Or they find ways around it. They say, no, it's just that we counted the Harrys in a different way that year, and so on. All of these things, there has been an enormous cost that people have been made to pay if they observe what's in front of their eyes. And so we get used to this sort of just period of lying.
Right.
And that's what we've been in.
What is the Orwell? It takes a great effort to see what is under one's nose.
Right.
All right, second concatenation. Again, I'm quoting you, Douglas.
Behold Europe's statistical nightmare. More British Muslims joined ISIS than their own military. Mohammed tops UK birth names, while Austria faces Muslim youth majority by 2050. Yet dare mention these inconvenient facts, and you're branded a bigot. Meanwhile, European leaders play statistical gymnastics, pretending demographic replacement is just a clerical error. When will this multicultural experiment's body count be high enough for honest discussion? Orwellian much.
At the same time that we've had this influx, at the same time Europe has lost faith in its beliefs, traditions, and legitimacy. Europe is now deeply weighed down with guilt for the past. And there is also the problem of an existential tiredness.
Yes.
And a feeling that perhaps for Europe the story has run out and a new story must be allowed to begin. Okay, take us through that a little. Now, the German war guilt, that's clear. Britain seems to me to be, so again, I'm speaking as an American. What was the Churchill movie that was just a big hit last year? We think of Britain.
Darkest Hour, yeah.
Britain has no apologies to make, no reason to feel guilty. Neil Ferguson, other people who've looked at the British colonies, on balance, it's a transfer of human capital.
Right.
They're not impoverishing the people of India. On the contrary. Right? And so why would you include Britain? Britain's the hard case to understand why Britain should feel guilty.
Yes.
Or an existential fatigue.
There's several things. One is the phenomenon that if you or I were to sum up all people across, say, Asia as having responsibility for the same thing, people would say,
Madness.
That's mad. I mean, you're not even picking out the important distinctions. You're being very generalizing.
Right.
But you can do that with Europe. So you can say, we did the Holocaust in Europe. You can even get away with that in London. Sorry, we. And then you take the other one, post-colonialism, which you refer to. Post-colonialism and post-colonial guilt is suffered in almost equal measure by, for instance, Britain, which undoubtedly ran quite a lot of the world in the past, and Sweden, which did not. So there's a strange thing that has emerged, which I try to explain in the book, where we end up summing up ourselves by our collectively worst moments. The flip side of that is we look at everyone else only by their best. So recent years, for instance, we've heard an awful lot, certainly since 9/11, about the Islamic Neoplatonists. No one talks very much about the Islamic Neoplatonists until this last 20 years. But the Islamic world is best represented by the Islamic Neoplatonists, whereas Europe is best represented by Auschwitz. Well, here you get to one of the problems of this, is that we are...
That's just uninformed.
Yeah, of course it's uninformed. All of it's uninformed, and it's also imbibed by vast swathes of the public and told to them by a huge amount of academics, media, politicians, and others. There's several reasons for that, isn't there? One is that you can do that almost cost-free as a modern politician, can't you? It's like the endless apologies for historical acts. It can gain you something, but it costs you nothing. All you're doing is selling out and misrepresenting the past. But you yourself might be able to polish a bit of your halo or burnish your reputation in some way. But this is just one element of this. This thing I describe as the sense of the story running out. A couple of people have said, and I'm very glad they've pointed this out, that in some ways it's the most original part of the argument of my book. The immigration bit is important and people should know about it. But this second bit, the us bit, what is it about us that would mean this all happened? Mm-hmm. Not many people have, I think, written about. And by the way, I'm very disturbed about this because almost none of my critics, and there are some sadly, but almost none of them pick up on this thing. Almost none of them. They go for me over the immigration,
right.
But they never pick up on this. That I have not to date had one critic who said, you're wrong on the existential tiredness. You're wrong on that. Our best days are all ahead of us, or any of that. I don't get any of that. And that's a disappointment because I was rather hoping I would.
Europe's civilizational masochism reaches new heights. While Islamic extremists glorify 7th century conquests, Europeans flagellate themselves over colonial history. Sweden, with 0 colonies, shares Britain's guilt complex. How's that for logic? Meanwhile, academia whitewashes Islamic imperialism while obsessing over European sins, With 47% of young Europeans rejecting traditional values, who needs enemies when self-loathing is trending? Civilizational by guilt, anyone. So any thoughts on what Douglas Murray just discussed? Share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you never miss any of our future debates.